specialist, Professor Ruth Pat-Horenczyk. Ruth is a clinical psychologist. She's both a clinician and a researcher. She's my colleague at the School of Social Work and has been doing extensive research on trauma for many, many years already, since our trauma didn't start just with this war, started long before. So Ruthie has been involved in research on parents and children and southern parts of Israel, and surviving breast cancer, which is another kind of trauma. She teaches courses on trauma, works internationally with many clinicians and researchers. And I think I'll just turn this to you, Ruthie, and I really appreciate the fact that you took the time to do this. You see, people are still joining, so thanks. So we'll hand it over to you.
Good evening. Thank you, Oria, for your kind introduction. I feel very honored to be here with you and to share with you our experience with working with trauma and resilience in the Israeli context for the last 20 years. Unfortunately, Ukraine and Israel share lots of traumatic experiences, and I think we can learn from each other. And indeed, I collaborate with some Ukrainian colleagues, both in Ukraine and the UK. And we've been working on intergenerational transmission of trauma and on the impact of trauma on psychotherapists and how is it for them to work under shared trauma, in the context of shared trauma, how they are impacted in terms of secondary traumatization, but also increased resilience. But today I will focus on our experience, and I will combine the research that we've been doing and that was based on our clinical work and how our clinical work informed or led to more research, because all our research is kind of an applied research or translational research that we learn from research and apply it in clinical work, and we take inspiration from the clinical work and ask more research questions. So first I will start with a brief introduction. I'm sure you know a lot about trauma, but just to clarify the concept that we'll be discussing, I'll give a brief introduction on trauma and survival mode and the essence of continuous traumatic stress as compared to isolated or single events, and then move to the trauma-informed intervention that we have been developing in Israel, mostly for children and parents, that are based in school-based screening and intervention and several early childhood projects that we put special emphasis on young children. So the American Psychological Association defined trauma as the emotional response to terrible events, and they focus mainly on the longer-term reactions, including unpredictable emotions, flashback, the impact of trauma on relationship, and physical symptoms, including the body, etc. The PTSD as a syndrome is defined by 5 different clusters. The first address the re-experiencing of the event and symptoms such as flashback or pictures that are intrusive, whether it's during sleep or during wakefulness. The second cluster in terms of clinical diagnosis address the avoidance, and that include avoidance of places, but also avoidance of emotions and feelings. As phenomena such as numbness, they don't feel anything, or lose interest in the world, are also under the cluster of avoidance. The third cluster, in terms of diagnosis according to DSM, is about symptoms of either hyperarousal or hypoarousal that, for example, manifest in alertness or being on the edge or being constant in the sense of emergency or vice versa. The fourth cluster relate to changes in cognitions and emotions like blaming others or blaming oneself, inability to remember parts of the events, etc. And the last cluster of PTSD is very important, and that really means what's the toll of PTSD in everyday life. It's the functional impairment, is the problems that people experience in learning, in social relations, in family functioning. So PTSD, as a result of exposure to trauma, is impaired functioning. Another important definition for trauma was put forward by Judith Herman, who wrote the most interesting book before Van der Kolk wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And she described in her book entitled Trauma and Recovery that traumatic events overwhelm the usual methods of coping that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. And I think this is a very broad and dynamic and deep understanding of the impact of trauma, and that gives a hint what should be done in therapy, how important is to regain control, to keep and regain the connection, the social support, and to build and rebuild the meaning after a traumatic event. I would like also to mention Janet Bullman, who developed the shatter assumption theory, and she addressed the impact of trauma on the worldview of people. And she pointed that after people experience trauma, they may no longer perceive the world as benevolent and predictable, or they may not perceive themselves as competent as they used to. It's like a breakdown of their identity, their worldview, their trust in the world. So that gives another direction for intervention. And last, I'd like to mention Thomas Friedman from the New York Times, who wrote after 9/11 that the main issue for the American society in this sense is not to look for more and more security, but rather to reassure that the society can be maintained as an open society. Because when trauma happens, we can become more suspicious, we can become more aggressive toward other parts of the society. And the main question is how we can maintain our open and right society. So when we talk about psychological trauma, sometimes people use the same word, trauma, to describe the traumatic events. The same word is used to describe the coping process or the meaning of the event, that the event was so difficult to handle. Or they focus on the short-term results of being exposed to traumatic event, or perhaps the long-term results. So I'd like to be clear that when we use the word trauma, we need to be very careful. What do we mean by the word describing the event or the consequences or the meaning of the event? It's important before I move forward to say that not all people who are exposed to trauma develop post-traumatic stress disorder. There are multiple trajectories and post-trauma adaptations profiles. The majority of people, and we should put it very clear, are resilient. Although we are exposed to terrible events, we are mostly able to cope in a healthy manner with the support of the family and friends, and the majority of people will be resilient. Resilience is more common than uncommon. Only minority of the people will develop PTSD, but there are other trajectories, such as post-traumatic growth, for example, that people may be impacted by the trauma for temporary, and then grow even to higher level of functioning and meaning in their life as a result of being exposed to traumatic events. There are people who may respond in delay. At first they look fine and then they develop psychopathology. There are people who takes longer to recover. There are multiple ways people react after trauma. And last, there are lots of meta-analyses that try to predict who will develop PTSD. And of course, there are risk factors. And among them, the research identified that people who were exposed to prior trauma are in higher risk. Those who had prior psychological problems in adjustment are in a higher risk. A family history of psychopathology increased the risk, and the perceived threat during the trauma, whether they were in life threat or close to the event or close to the threat, increased the risk. On the contrary, the level of social support decreased the risk for developing PTSD, and whether the people were in dissociation during the trauma increased the risk for developing PTSD. I will now move to describing another state which was termed as survival mode, which is different than post-traumatic reaction. And habitually, survival mode is explained when a person walks in the forest and meets a bear. And usually the natural responses are, you're probably familiar with this, fight, flight, freeze. Either you fight with a bear, you need to survive, or you are able to run away or flight from the bear, or sometimes the automatic response is to freeze. If it's a snake, maybe freezing is more adaptable. And a last F that was added is befriended, because during exposure to trauma, people look for each other. They want to be together. They want to find support and comparisons and cohesion. So when we are threatened by danger, we either fight, flight, freeze, and certainly try to look for people. And these are instinctive responses that exist, and people need to be familiar with that, because some people are ashamed that they may have frozen during traumatic event. We hear it very often with sexual assaults, that women or young women describe a state of freezing, of inability to respond, and they blame themselves, they feel shame. And this need to be explained as, one of the automatic survival mode that sometimes is adaptive. She may have saved her life, although she couldn't avoid the trauma. So why is it important, the survival mode? Because we need to understand that the survival mode is normal. The issue is, how can we get out of the survival mode or bounce back? That's the normal response to trauma. And when we consider continuous traumatic stress, that the threat is appearing over and over again, there is an alarm and another alarm, there are missiles and again another missile, and the threat doesn't stop after one exposure, but is continually happen. An important question is, do we habituate? Do we get used to? Is our response reduced? Or do we suffer from accumulation of trauma, which is called allostatic load? And allostatic load means accumulation of the same exposure to traumatic events or different type of traumatic events that accumulate, and they make us more vulnerable to psychopathology and distress. And it's a big question that the research, current research, is dealing with this. Do we habituate, or do we get more vulnerable or weakened by the accumulated trauma like this donkey? We can no longer. I'll be happy to stop here and hear from you. What do you think? Before I'll show evidence for one direction or the other. Is this possible? If anybody wants to, or we can vote for it. If anybody wants to say it, to express his idea, do we habituate to repeated exposure of traumatic events, or we become more vulnerable as a result of the accumulation of traumatic events? I can't look for the chat, so I don't know if people responded or not. Somebody raised the hand, so maybe we can hear.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was thinking that both are possible, depending on the person and the psychological type, I guess. That's just my opinion. I don't really know, actually.
So in different aspects, that's an interesting response. In different aspects, we habituate. So the response goes, we are very affected and then get habituated. And in other aspects, we just accumulate more and more vulnerability. Would you try to guess in which aspects we habituate and in others we become more vulnerable? Maybe Olena has an answer?
I think that if these problems accumulate and we don't digest them by means of maybe support or by means of psychological therapy, it will overload us. It will be like constipation inside, and we will not habituate.
So you raise the issue of the main aspect of trauma treatment, which is processing the trauma. If we process it and we become more aware of the impact and we build our meaning and we repeat and create a narrative of what happened, that will enable us to habituate more than be impacted more, if I understood you right. Okay. So another aspect before I move to the interventions, which is crucial to trauma treatment and relevant to what Olena said, is understanding what we call the window of tolerance. Because in our normal life, our arousal is within threshold upper and lower threshold, up and down like this. And when trauma impact, it throw out of the threshold, either toward hyperarousal, it break the upper threshold, or to hyperarousal. And this is the main message that is very relevant to every trauma therapist, that there is a window of tolerance, which is the optimal level of arousal within we can process trauma and we can conduct psychotherapy. If the person breaks the upper level and is in a state of hyperarousal, is unable to listen and absorb. It's like, everything is blurred for him, is not connected. Same is true if he's hyperaroused, if he's disconnected, if he's dissociated, he is not there, you cannot process the trauma with him. So the main purpose of all interventions after trauma is to resume what we call the window of tolerance, to calm down, to help the people regain normal level of awareness, otherwise, of arousal. Otherwise, they are not available to listen or to respond or to express. It reminds me that after 9/11, we had a visit of a famous psychologist from New York. And he said, after 9/11, people don't need psychologists. They need chicken soup. He meant you need to calm down. You need to regain your safety, to go back to your normal arousal. Otherwise, you are unable to process. You don't need to start talking immediately. You need to look for the basic need of people, connect them to their loved one, give them some food, rest, so they will be able to bounce back to the window of tolerance, optimal level. And only when they are safe and stabilized, you can start process the trauma. So now I'll move and describe you what we have been doing for the last 20 years in the area of trauma and resilience. And I will also describe you briefly what we've been doing since October 7th in the context of our worst traumatic events since the Holocaust. So we started our research after 9/11. And actually after 9/11, okay, doesn't move. Stuck. Okay. I read the report of the Ministry of Education from New York City, and they conducted, after 6 months after the 9/11 attacks, a survey among school children, a large sample of more than 8,000 school children in New York, in 4th to 12th grade. Some of them were near the Twin Towers, some of them were more in a more distant area, and that was conducted by Columbia University. And the results of this report are very important and really inspired all our interventions with children. What they found is about 2/3 of the students that they screened in school and they suffered from post-traumatic symptoms were not turned or referred to treatment either within the school or by any mental health professional in the community. That means 2/3 of the children that were suffering with symptoms were not identified. They were suffering in silence. The adults and the professional didn't know even that they were suffering from post-traumatic stress. First of all, because it looks, the symptoms in children manifest in different clinical pictures. And second, they didn't know how to identify them. And we realized that if we want to help the children, we need first to go to the schools because this is where they are. This is the best way to identify traumatized children in their natural environment with no stigma. It's cost effective. We can reach out lots of children because we're talking about mass traumatic events. And if we want to find those children who suffer in silence, we better reach out and ask them directly. If you don't ask, you don't know. And then we learn that this should be part of continuity of services. First, we need to identify them. Then we need to provide them with interventions. And the intervention need to be in triage. We need to identify the most traumatized and treat them in trauma treatment, and the majority that may need only resilience building and strengthening their coping strategy, and those who may not need any intervention as well. And that's a very important lesson. We don't need to overtreat everybody. Not everybody is traumatized. The most common trajectory is resilience. Yet, we shouldn't undermine the number of children who are traumatized. So we shouldn't do these two types of error. Treat everybody and pathologize everybody, or ignore the psychopathology that needs special interventions. So school-based intervention and screening has been done in many post-disaster areas. After hurricane in Hawaii, after the war in Bosnia, after 9/11, after the terrorism in Oklahoma and Kenya and Tanzania, there were lots of school-based screening initiative that proved to be very effective. So we learned from it. And we learned that trauma impacted a lot the school performance. And traumatized children have lower grade point average. How can they concentrate if they are hyper-aroused or hyper-aroused? They tend to be absent from school. They tend to complain about physical symptoms. They have problems to concentrate. So if we want to help the children, we need to identify and provide them with intervention. So I'm moving from the United States to our context, and our context was repeated terrorist attacks in buses and restaurants, buses that were bombed and restaurants that were bombed during the Second Intifada. And we started to work with children in schools in this context. The idea was, in terms of clinical perspective, that the model should be very clinical. We need to first to train the teachers and the leading team of the school to understand how trauma impacts children. Then we need to give psychoeducation to parents and conducted parents meeting to teach them how trauma manifests in children, because they didn't know how to identify it, as we learned from the 9/11 experience. And we conducted screening in school. We reached out all children in school and gave them questionnaire. Now you can do it online, questionnaires, and this is the way to screen who needs help. I remember that one of the girls in this one school that I was there, she said, "Do you think I need to tell how much I suffer at night?" And I just replied to her asking, "Do you think you need to stay alone with this?" And she did responded. So when we ask children, they do answer. And this is most of the research that we did led to developing of school-based interventions. And we developed differential intervention for those who are highly traumatized and for those who are less traumatized. And there are lots of publications that I'll be happy to share with you, those who are interested. Anyway, so what did we find? I just go on briefly on what did we ask. We asked about the exposure to trauma. We were asked about symptoms, about functional impairment, about depression and anxiety, about somatic complaints. And that's something that I would like to give an example, because it's a group of clinicians that, for example, we found that one of the children that was highly motivated before a specific event started to complain on all kinds of physical problems and avoided school very often. And only when we really talked to him, we understood that he lived far away and he was supposed to take 2 buses in order to get to school, and he was afraid. So he used to get up 5 o'clock in the morning and walk for 2-3 hours to get to school, and you can't do it every day. So he invented all kinds of somatic complaints because he was ashamed to say that he's afraid and avoid buses. So somatization is very common among children, and that's something that you need to be very sensitive. But we didn't only look for risk factors, and we also look for the protective factors, how social support can help, how self-efficacy or flexibility or optimism can help children cope with the events. So what did we find? And I just take few. We have like more than 100 publications. So I will just sample few that I think convey the message for clinicians. For example, we found that direct exposure, of course, lead to more symptoms, but also those children who were indirectly exposed, those who were what we call near miss. They were supposed to take the bus but were late and the bus was bombed. Or they just went out from a restaurant that few minutes later was attacked. They were not injured, but the near miss experience that it could have happened, and only a matter of few seconds, or if I would have, impact them very similarly. So I'm thinking about your context, not only the people who are at the scene of the traumatic event, but those who are almost near miss, intended to, or almost came, were similarly impacted. In terms of fear and PTSD, majority of children experience fear, but that doesn't mean that it's PTSD. We shouldn't overdiagnose PTSD. PTSD, as I mentioned, need to fulfill the criteria of 5 clusters: exposure and avoidance and arousal problems and problems in feeling and memory and functional impairment. The majority of children were anxious but not suffer from PTSD. In terms of gender differences, it's very important to know, because the literature shows that girls suffer more PTSD than boys. But that wasn't the case in our finding. We just found that girls complained more on symptoms and share their fears and emotional problems. The boys show their distress in different ways. They manifest the PTSD in functional impairment, in risk-taking behavior, in impulsivity, in aggression. So boys and girls may manifest their distress in different ways. It doesn't mean that the boys don't suffer. And the girls more complained about depression and about somatic complaints, but among the boys, there were more behavioral problems. So we published several papers, one on the toll of the exposure to terrorism on adolescents, and mainly focused on the functional impairment and how it differed between boys and girls. And one important finding was how trauma is associated with risk-taking behavior. And the question was, does the exposure of ongoing terrorism influence risk-taking behavior? And the fact was that there are lots of evidence that adolescents are engaging in lots of risk-taking behavior, more substance abuse, more violence, reckless driving, and all kind of risk-taking behavior, as if, life is so dangerous, why not take risks? We published this paper showing that there is a strong association between suffering from post-traumatic symptoms and risk-taking behavior, and I'll give you the example. Have a look. We know that adolescents exercise risk-taking behavior, but the small numbers is a normal sample of adolescents that doesn't suffer from PTSD. The large numbers is the rate of risk-taking behavior among youth that suffer from PTSD. And you can see it's almost double using drugs. It's almost double drinking alcohol. It's almost double in dangerous roulette games like Russian roulette. So that means that not exposure to trauma, but suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. As I said, not all children who are exposed to trauma develop PTSD, but those who do develop post-traumatic stress symptoms tend to exercise more risk-taking behavior, twice as much. So the lesson for clinician is, if you see post-traumatic stress disorder in youth, be careful to look for risk-taking behavior, and vice versa. If you see risk-taking behavior, be careful to ask if there is trauma in the background. Okay? Boys have higher rate of risk-taking behavior, except one topic, which is, can anybody guess in what aspect girls have more risk-taking behavior than boys? It's mostly in eating disorders. And how did they explain this? We asked them. First, you need to know that if you ask the children and in the youth, they do answer. People didn't believe us that they will respond to questionnaire, but they did. And when we asked them, how do you explain the fact that your friends, not you, exercise more risk-taking behavior? They answered, and these are their own words. Some things that seem not dangerous can be deadly, like taking a bus. And some things that are considered dangerous, like taking drugs, may be harmless. It's like they are confused. Life is short, so let's take chances. Or maybe the worst sentence or the more alarming sentence is, I prefer to decide what to do with my life and not let them decide for me. If I'm going to be dead, I prefer to kill myself and not let anybody else decide about my life. If you regress to adolescent language, you may understand it. It doesn't make sense to us, but it does make sense in adolescents' language. There are many theories. Oria is an expert for adolescent, whether these youth want to re-experience the trauma, reenactment, or the perception of the world and future orientation is influenced, or they want to experience again hyperarousal, or maybe, and we were surprised to find many of them actually ask for help using risk-taking behavior. They cry for help through risk-taking behavior. Then we moved to seeking help. The question, how do we know who needs help? Maybe we should ask them directly. If you want to know who needs help, ask them. And we did. We just asked one question. Do you need help? And of course, we had all the results that could be obtained from the screening to know who is indeed suffering or not. But the interesting issue is that those who are not having symptoms, they say, no, we don't need help. And indeed, they don't need help. But if you look here, those who say, yes, I need help, many of them indeed need help. And those who say, I might need help, in adolescent language is, yes, I do need help. So if you see in the majority of the youth who say, yes, I need help, indeed need help. So maybe the smartest way is ask them directly. I'd like to mention one study that we did with Palestinian colleagues, and we used the same measures and the same tools and found PTSD among Israeli and Palestinians. Of course, it was much higher among the Palestinians who were exposed to more trauma, but we find also similarities, that the more exposure to trauma leads to more symptoms, and that girls report more on depression and somatic complaints and hopelessness, while boys report more on behavioral problems. We published that too. I'd like to move to some protective factors, because as I said, resilience is more common, and resilience is what Anne Maston called ordinary magic. It's like magic how most children are okay, most adults are okay, but yet it's more common than uncommon. And we looked for several factors. First of all, the importance of keeping the daily routine. I don't know how it is in Ukraine, but what we found that those youth who continue their daily routine and they go to their usual activities and resume their daily routine immediately after something happened, do not avoid, function much better. So when we recommend children stick to your routine and go on, we do this based on research. We also looked for all kind of protective factors, but I don't think we have time to go through it. But it's so important to understand that we need not to look only on the risk factors, we need to look on the protective factors. So those children who have self-efficacy and flexibility and good coping can be less affected. Those who have social support, know how to ask for help, maintain their routine, are less vulnerable. In terms of intervention, we learned that it's not enough to work with children in school. We need to work with the entire city. We want to train medical doctors, pediatrician, policemen, firefighter, that they will know how to identify trauma and how to identify them in children, and that will build resilience in citywide approach. Last, we started to move to the application and the technological frontier. And I know I've been working with Ukrainian colleagues on how to develop application for self-regulation and early intervention or psychological first aid after traumatic events that can be accessible through the phone and application. We need to be aware that continuous traumatic stress is different than isolated event, but also in continuous traumatic stress, we can provide services for long run, and application and virtual and all kind of technological solution can be very effective. I'd like to say a few things about what we did in the context of our recent traumatic experiences, or maybe I'll stop here and give you some time to questions before we move to early childhood. Just let me know. How am I doing in terms of time? Okay. What we did after our traumatic events, we did surveys for entire communities, because we understood that if we have a large number of affected people, it's a mass trauma. We cannot work individually. It's a collective trauma. It's a nation that is in trauma and in mourning, in grief. It's a nation that worry for the kidnapped people. And it's unprecedented number of casualties. So what do we do in such large numbers of affected people? And we went to big surveys, okay? Before this, I would like to say that not only the nation was affected negatively, there were lots of signs of volunteerism and solidarity and heroism, which really gave some strength as well, not just trauma. We went and did need assessment for entire communities that were evacuated. And I just want to mention two results from many different results that we obtained, which are important. We asked them, what do you need? You were just evacuated from your home to different hotels. It was a big community of Sderot near Gaza Strip that were evacuated to 100 different hotels across this country. We sent them questionnaire through the internet and asked, what do you need? What do you need in such a new situation? And that's why I would like to share with you that the most frequent and important need that they mentioned is the need for emotional support for their children. 63% rated it as the top need. They didn't ask for money or for, computers or medications or help with their pets or older parents. They asked for help for the children. And for normal activities, what they are going to do in hotel rooms. They need normal activities and help for the children. Another big research that we did among a large community that I'd like to share with you is the importance of volunteerism. That it struck us that half of the people who were evacuated from their home wanted to help each other, wanted to volunteer. And that's a main source of resilience, a main source of strength. And we found that men were more willing to volunteer than women, which I don't know how to explain. Maybe women were more busy with their kids, but I think it's a very impressive result that even after such mass trauma, people are willing to help each other. And of course, those who are willing to volunteer or already volunteer suffer from less distress than the other. So 43% of the people in the big sample that we tested said they want to volunteer. And it was interesting that it's about 2/3 of those who volunteered in the past were willing to volunteer even under the traumatic circumstances, but not less interesting that those who never volunteer, 30% of them were willing to volunteer under that circumstances. I think that is very important in terms of message to the professional that it's important to screen for distress, PTSD, depression, etc. But it's no less important to strengthen the protective factor, the helping other, the altruism, because that helps people cope no less. So I'd like to move to our early childhood project, if this is okay, but I'll stop here if there is any question or any comment that anybody wants to say now. I think I'm rushing because I want to share with you so much work that we've been doing that hopefully may be relevant to you one way or another. So I think one of the new development that we did was the focus on young children, because if children were not observed and were not identified as suffering for post-traumatic stress disorder, young children were neglected totally, because we usually don't know how to identify the traumatic impact on young children. And the main question that I'm asking, do you think that young age is a risk factor or protective factor for long-term effect of trauma in children? Are they at risk, or maybe they are protected because they don't understand what we do? What do you think? More risk or more protected? Yes, Bodam.
I think they're more at risk.
Yeah, okay. So that's a disclosure that I want to say. I'm going to try to convince you that the evidence support that younger children are more at risk, not only because they are impacted directly, because they are impacted through the impact on their parents. They don't have optimal parenting and optimal environment to grow and develop. So this is our context, how children drew the missiles and the alarm and the ambulances. And we learned from Michael Sheringa, he's from the United States, and he developed in 20 years ago a special criteria for the diagnosis of toddlers. And he said, well, it's not just regular PTSD like older children or adults. You have to look specifically for the developmental problem that manifests either in regressive behavior, restriction of play, new fears, new nightmares, loss of interest. They are not going to talk about the event, but they are going to show it in behavior and in regressive behavior and in problems of behavior. And that taught us how to diagnose children or to screen for post-traumatic stress in young children. And that's something that I'd like to stress, that there is relational PTSD. It's the co-occurrence of post-trauma simultaneously in parent and child, when the symptomatology of the parents here affect the child and exacerbate the problem of the child. So we started to understand, we know how the problems of the parents, the symptoms of the parents, the post-traumatic symptoms of the parents, or the depression of the parents, we know that it affects the child problems. But the question is, through what? Through what mechanism? Is it because it impairs the attachment? Or is it because it restricts the reflective functioning of the parents? He cannot talk to the child and explain him what's going on and teach him how to understand what's happening to him. Maybe he cannot be attuned and sensitive to the child. Maybe it impairs his competence to be a parent. And all this affects the child symptoms. We'd like to know what the mechanism. And we specifically focused on the emotion regulation, or the parental emotion regulation. If the parent cannot regulate his emotion, that is the effect on children. And here is a good illustration. What happened to the regulation during traumatic event? Usually the mother needs to regulate herself, and it's an internal process. She needs to calm herself, and this is the way she helped the child regulate. And then the child learned to regulate himself, right? That's the normal process. But what happened if trauma happened? When trauma happened, the mother may suffer from symptoms, post-traumatic symptom, and she's less able to regulate herself or to control herself. And then she's less able to provide co-regulation for the child. She's less sensitive, attuned, less providing reflective functioning or good modeling. And then the child failed to regulate himself. And he developed all kind of symptoms, externalizing symptoms, internalizing symptoms, and traumatized child make it harder on the mother to calm himself and to become and to be able to regulate him. And that's a vicious cycle how trauma in parents affect the children. So we started to assess the ability of the parents to regulate with them, regulate their emotion, and teach them how they better regulate the emotion. And this, I'll give you just a few examples, and you can see that this was the main issue for interventions with parents. We interviewed them, and they said, everything changes. When my child feels insecure, he doesn't play, doesn't try new things. He regrets. He avoids. He behaves like a younger child, bedwetting, asking for a bottle or pacifier. So they understand what happened to the child, and then we teach them how to regulate the child. I'll jump this because we don't have time, and just explain what we did with the young children. We developed program for parents and young children how to make room for play and how to play with the children and to provide them processing of the event, good modeling, and helping regulate themselves and helping regulate their children. So I'll finish with this because time is short, but the idea was to help parents to improve their own emotional regulation. And if they improve their emotional regulation, they will help children improve their regulation through play activities and playfulness. And they will learn how to identify the distress in the child and how to help him process it and use the play to provide meaning and narrative that can help the child understand and feel safe. The program that we have had 8 meetings, and each meeting focus on a different topic, how to strengthen the parental ability to provide a secure protective base despite the fact that it's dangerous outside. The parents can provide a safe haven for the child, and if the parents provide safety, the child will be secure. How not to let the situation impair the independence of the child, not to be overprotective. How to play with creativity. How to reflect intentions and emotion. How to express feeling, etc. This was the program. We wrote about it, and you can read about it. And I just want to conclude that in one of the conferences, I met with Palestinian colleagues, and they did the same on the Palestinian side. This is a presentation that was given by a Finnish expert on attachment, Raina Punamaki, and she did a program in Gaza for young children and parents, not now, but 15 years ago, how to prevent disorganized attachment and how to teach the mothers to enhance secure child-mother interaction, support the availability of the mother, and encourage the regulation. So I guess we all understand that it takes a village to raise a child, and we need a community to protect our children. And I'd like to just to acknowledge the team that have been working with me, and to mention these are the 2 books we wrote about different types of treatment for children. And I'm aware it's 8 o'clock, so I better stop here and let you ask questions if you have.
Ruth, thank you very much for your presentation. I think there's a question in Ukrainian in the chat. Maybe someone would be able to translate.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I actually gave a lecture to a large group of psychologists from Ukraine, and they asked for all kind of material, which I sent them. And of course, there are different programs for parents and children, and screening, and school-based intervention, and principles of trauma work. That's why I started with the introduction, because if you understand the window of tolerance, that's the principle that is more important than technique. If you understand the principle, you can use different technique. First, calm down. And only when the person is stabilized, you can process it. And you can process it in different ways, in play, in art, in stories, in words. But the trauma need to be processed. And children need to be processed with their parents. These are the best people that they trust, and you need to train parents. You don't need to treat children directly. You need to train the parents. So there are plenty of material that I'll be happy to send you, including 2 papers that were published in collaboration with Larissa Zaykova from Lutz, from on work that we did comparing Ukrainian and Israelis in terms of intergenerational transmission and impact of the trauma work on the therapist.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I can send a presentation, and I can send you several publications. And I know Larissa has been writing on assessment of use in Ukraine. So she has measures in Ukraine as well.
So Ruti, can you send me the materials and I'll distribute them? Okay.
Yes, and I can send the email of Larissa, who is now in the UK, that can send measures in Ukrainian.
Okay. Can you write her name here on the chat?
Yes.
It's not the Larissa that we invited to Brno. It's a different person. So.
And okay, Larissa Zaykova. Here. I will write it in the chat.
Okay.
Here. This is the email.
And she's in the UK now? She's living in the UK?
Yeah, she's now, yeah, she moved, and she's half-time in Cambridge, and Ukraine, and half-time in different university in the UK.
So she has measures, but does she also have the intervention model in Ukraine, or?
Yeah, she took,
yes.
And actually she took all the materials from us. She translated into Ukraine. They did it. She's on the border near Poland, so she lives not in east. I know the east of Ukraine is much more exposed, but she's been working a lot with psychologists and adjusting the Ukrainian material. And I'll be sending you the 2 papers by her. I think she's a great source for materials if you're interested. And I know that as a result of the previous talk, psychologists started to do all kind of things in schools. Because how can we reach out large numbers of children? And children, I hope, Bodham, you are convinced that children are more vulnerable.
Okay, I see a question here on the chat. Do you see it? What is the solution for Ukraine and Ukrainian children in the situation we find ourselves? What is your opinion?
First of all, I'm impressed by the Ukrainian people, how resilient and strong they are. And if they provide good rationale We are fighting for our freedom. We've been able to fight for years. We survived so many different crises, and you know better than I about the long history of trauma in Ukraine, including I learned from Larissa on the Holodomor, but of course there are more trauma following the Holodomor. I think the parents can provide lots of strength to their children if they have strong meaning for what is happening and hope that it will be successful and you prevail. And that gives meaning and build a good, coherent narrative of all this traumatic period, but there is a good reason why, and there is a good hope for better future. So I was impressed. We looked for distress among the Ukrainian, and we found lots of strength and resilience. Unbelievable. People said, we learned from our parents, we are able to cope with difficult situations, and we trust ourselves. Unbelievable. And I guess we are similar in it, in this aspect, because we've been going through a terrible period and terrible year, and yet we also find strength in the strength of the people, in their voluntarism, in their involvement, in their heroism, in their trust, and in their optimism for better future, and in their willingness to fight and to do whatever it takes to bring this better future for our people and children.
Wow, thank you.
I do have a commentary. I'm not sure, Ria, do you hear me?
Yes,
Sure.
you're from
Yes,
here,
okay.
loud and clear.
Yes. So thank you, Ruth, for this really outstanding presentation in this webinar for SPR. So I guess my commentary, you presented research data on this solidarity, and I think you really showed how you assess and use this between human connection that may actually be increased in the time of war and crisis. And so that's a little bit how I interpret your finding that some men seems to be, more voluntary suddenly and kind of reaching out and being, help other people, while they maybe in their everyday life they weren't doing it as much. And also the same goes for me with what you present with the children, the small children, how actually in your intervention you use that bond to help and help cure, but also prevent further damage. So thank you for doing this.
This is beautiful comment, and we did not talk here about post-traumatic growth, but there is post-traumatic growth as a result of trauma, which doesn't exclude distress. You can be distressed, you can impact it, and yet grow. And post-traumatic growth is manifest in 5 domains: appreciation of life, more appreciation of life, more appreciation of new opportunities that didn't exist for you before. Belief in your strengths, you show strengths that you are even surprised by yourself. Appreciation of social connection and some spiritual growth. So even though Ukraine and Israel is going through very challenging time, yet there are positive development as well that show in solidarity, cohesiveness, strengths, new opportunities. And I think the model the adults will show to the children and a good narrative that they will build out of it has lots of protective factors. And I think post-traumatic growth need to be on the acknowledged as well.
Thanks.
І я
хочу попросити, то Дідковська. Чути мене, не чути?
Yeah.
Алло. Чути. Дуже дякую, Настя. Я хочу всім дуже подякувати. І тим, котрі слухають наших доповідачів. І найважливіше, всім, хто це організовує ось вже роки. І Ойрі, і Єлі, і Міхалові за те, що ми не самотні в своїх викликах, ми не самотні в своїх потребах, ми не самотні в своїх фахових знаннях, які потрібні щодня, ось вже 3 роки від початку повномасштабного вторгнення. І я хотіла так дуже швидко оголосити, що ті опитування, які ви заповняли, це є наш командний продукт СПР і українських психотерапевтів. Ми маємо вже більше 100 анкет. Вони пораховані, тобто заповнених даних. Вони пораховані, і ми можемо вислати інтерпретацію після того, як ми отримаємо вже кінцеву кількість заповнених анкет. Це те, про що ми просили вас попереднього разу, це те, про що ми просимо вас цього разу також. Будь ласка, ті, хто ще не відповідали на питання опитувальника, Катерино, можна попросити, щоб ви скинули це відразу десь там чи в чат, чи кудись. І я думаю, що після цього разу ми вже все разом будемо інтерпретувати. І я маю велике сподівання, що з цим матеріалом ми зможемо або написати спільну статтю з нашими міжнародними друзями, або виступити на Краківській конференції як результат досліджень емоційного стану українських психотерапевтів. І, крім того, як результат динаміки зміни нашого психоемоційного стану, власне, в результаті прослуховування ось цих важливих і потрібних для нас лекцій. Тому низький уклін і велика сердечна вдячність і тим, хто нам допомагає, і всім нам, які роблять свою найпотрібнішу і найважливішу справу цих 3 роки війни. Дякую сердечно.
Thank you also, Larissa. Unfortunately, I have only a few minutes left because I'm participating in another event right now. So I would like to underline that we are thankful for all our Ukrainian colleagues who participate in the lectures. We are grateful also to Larissa, to Natasha, Larissa Didaskoja and Natasha Turbovec, and we are also grateful to Anastasia Fakir, who does a lot of translating for us, and of course Katarina Kochanowska, who really coordinates this from the Ukrainian side and from SPR side. Thank you very much to Juan Cruz, who is doing a wonderful job, and also for this webinar, Galit Peszkovi, who helped us with the flyer and with the advertisement of the event. So thank you. Thanks to all of you. We've got hundreds of participants, and this shows the strength of this connection. So thank you very much to everyone, and also to Araya for today, to Ruth for her enormous knowledge and experience. Your findings are in line with our findings in Poland, considering Siberian deportees, people who were deported by Russia to Siberia. So we've got also findings on that. And thank you also to Uli, because without him, this initiative would not happen. So thank you all. And I have to leave, unfortunately. Yeah. So good luck to everyone.
See you. Okay, well, you wanted to make some, and I will write you about the next webinars. Because of the situation in Israel, one person who was supposed to do it is now involved with the hostages. So she's a little busy, and I have someone else. So I will update you very shortly and 2 more presentations. Okay, Willie, you wanted to make some announcements.
Oh, actually, the announcement was already given now by Larissa, the only thing I can say is thanks everybody for attending. Thank you, Aurea. Thank you, Ruth, and everyone who attended. It's been really an important initiative, and it's I think it's over almost 3 years. We're growing strong, so continuously supporting. SPR is continuously supporting the Ukrainian communities of psychotherapists, and we're proudly doing it. And now with this new topic on the what Israel and Israeli psychotherapists and researchers can contribute to the development of Ukrainian psychotherapists, I'm so excited to learn more in the next webinar, and we're waiting to see when that's going to be. So thank you everyone for attending, and see you soon.
Thank you. And Bodan, we saw you had a question. So if you want to write me an email about the complex PTSD, I will forward it to Ruth and you'll get a response. Okay?
Well, that's a totally different topic, right?
Yeah, I know. So.
I see.
Okay. So good night, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
And let's hope for the end of violence from all
over the world. Yes. We can be optimistic.